We say we've got kind of an intimate group here, and that's actually kind of great, because what I'm hoping is that it means that we can have some really in-depth and fruitful discussions. And I'm really thinking about the challenge of the subtitle of the conference here today. And I think there are two principles there. One is to be an inclusive community and to be a sustaining community. And those of you that have been involved in the TESOL field, the TESOL Association, we all know how important research is, but we also know that defining, identifying, figuring out sort of the relationship between research and practice has been an ongoing challenge for the field and within the association. And I think I can speak honestly in that regard. And I've got two past presidents and a number in the audience as well who will echo me in that it's been a long-term discussion. Let me make sure I got the buttons right. We should have had that slide there. Okay, and that slide. What I'd like to focus my remarks about a little bit is sort of the history of the recent history of the discussion within the TESOL Association. And the discussion has been centered on a document that we've called a research agenda. And the most recent research agenda was issued by the association, approved by the board of directors in 2014. It was actually the third research agenda that the association has put out. Kathy, I think you were on the first and the third, right? So the committees that struck the first and the third. I know I was on the second and third. June, you were on the third. Were you on the first? I cannot remember. I know. I think you were. I think you were on the executive committee when maybe the first one came out.
Yeah, probably two.
Or somewhere along there, or two, the second one. And having been on the committee that issued an agenda for an association that represents a field as broad as ours, right? And TESOL is an extremely broad field. It is international. It touches on almost all sectors of education. It deals with everything from producing materials to assessment to various forms of practice, technology-mediated instruction. It's an extremely broad field. And trying to come up with something that constituted an agenda for research for a broad field has been an ongoing challenge, right? But one of the lessons that I learned, or one of the sort of realizations that I came to over at least working with this twice, was that agenda can mean different things. And the default association that I started with when I heard the word agenda was that an agenda is simply a list of things that should be done. All right, it's like my grocery list. Or my task list that, whatever it is. And so it would be simply a list of what are the most pressing projects that somebody needs to do research on, all right? And so each time that I was on this committee, we'd sit down and the discussion started with, so how do we figure out what the most pressing list is for a field that is diverse as TESOL? And we would kind of all look at each other and we would ask, how many hours do you have to devote to this committee? And because we've got, as researchers, we feel we need a principled way to, make a claim, right? We'd have to do some research. How would we do some research to come up with a list of priorities? And we sort of think about it as a research project for a little bit, and then we said, we don't really quite have that many hours. And even if we did, would we feel, how comfortable would we feel saying, this is the grocery list for this field? Do we want to put our neck out there and say that? But then we sort of begin to take the wider context of the sentence. When you begin to say an agenda for a field, the other thing is to think about, well, what is the role of research? So not necessarily what are the projects that need to be done, but how should we think about research fitting into the field? And that has been a much more productive discussion. And I'm going to outline a little bit about the latest research agenda that was issued in 2014, but thinking of it in those terms, that this is the idea of how does research fit into our field? What should its role be in every member of the field's professional life, in a sense? And I think that when you start with that definition, that you then begin to say, well, community is is an outgrowth of that, right? That what we need as a field is a strong, inclusive, sustainable community there. And so I think that the theme for this conference is a very nice extension of what the discussion that's already started. And that in addition to the idea of an agenda for a field, that we want to be encouraging every member of this field to think of what their own agenda is with respect to research. And how do we encourage our field and the members of our field to think in that way? So, anybody wants to pull out their technology scan, you can get to a link. The document is housed on the TESOL website. The table of contents, if you don't have, really good eyesight and can't read that, essentially what the document that we came up with was divided into a section that first sort of provides the overall, but also what do we mean even by the term research, all right? So a definition of research, how it fits into a field. The other thing that, and I believe this was a section that was originally introduced with the second research agenda, was the need to explicitly talk about the connection between ethics and research. And so there's a section in the document on what the ethical conduct of research in the TESOL field should be. And this is a good resource for the field, and especially people who are working in contexts that maybe don't have, for example, a strong IRB culture or human subjects culture. And so this is something that we felt we could put out there as a resource. The next section is a more broader sort of one that we frame as directions. And this is somewhat close to how do you begin to create that grocery list. It's a framework. And I want to keep stressing that idea that it's a framework, it's not the actual list. And then one of the additions with the last version of the research agenda, the 2014, was to say, okay, how do you go from that sort of broad framework that is very inclusive to everyone, including people who are publishing research within a university context or higher education, who are being promoted on the basis of their research, and bring it home to people for whom doing research is a way of making their practice better, and that's the primary reward for it. And that we really needed to address that audience explicitly, and that's where the document ends. So very quickly, let me sort of step through some of the content of it. How did we define it? We came up with a nice, I think, academic definition, but it's one I really like and find useful. We begin by talking about it as inquiry, but it is spirited inquiry. It is systematic as well. So both spirited, motivated, but also systematic. And that again is something that can be, I think, meaningful to many different people in different contexts. Secondly, it contributes to the knowledge base, all right? There is an outgrowth, all right? And there's a contribution back, there is a connection to, if you will. And it is knowledge which can provide a basis for discussion, all right? It's knowledge that can be acted upon, reflected upon. It has a scope, which is that scope is areas of practice, including, and I think the word including is very intentional, language learning, teaching, designing programs, materials, all right? Because, and again, that's not all, but these are sort of core areas, if you will. I would challenge you to think of, if you were to say what areas belong in TESOL research, what would your list include? All right? And I think that's a key part. And finally, guided by and contribute back to, in a sense, theoretical approach. We are an applied field. We are very practitioner-oriented, and yet we have to contribute to the role of theory as in relation to practice. All right? What are the frameworks that guide thinking, and how does research build that theory? As I said, there's a section on ethics, very just sort of both what are society's expectations for people doing research, but also beginning to seed some questions, because one of the things we realize is that many people think IRB is simply a formality, right? And you need to kind of unpack some of the assumptions that researchers often have to understand how what they think is obvious can have adverse consequences. And so we've tried to open that up, again, as a discussion starter. And I'd encourage any of you who are, for example, doing teacher education, maybe to look at this as a potential resource, again, for starting a discussion there. Finally, and this is some of the work that I'm very proud of, is the idea of the framework. And the first, so much for that, this is what happens when you transfer slides from one to another. The first bullet says that whatever you're researching, start with your own context and find something which is practical and relevant to you, which is meaningful. And then what we encourage people to do is to sort of think about how questions that you may have fit into a matrix. And the first matrix is one of sort of focus. And are you thinking about questions which are about how individuals change over time, how language is learned, how learners learn, all right? Are you focused on sort of processes of individual change? Are your questions more related to what happens when you get people interacting with each other, for example, in a classroom? So if you're focusing on, in a sense, the fact that language is learned in the context of a community, be it inside the classroom or outside of the classroom, and many research questions look that way. Finally, language learning has an impact on our world, all right? It has societal impact. That's what we meant by, in a sense, focus, or you can think of it as level. The columns in the matrix are the notion of identifying change drivers. And the idea is here, what are the hot buttons? What are the hot topics that, in a sense, are triggering new areas of research? In the 2014 agenda, We identified new understandings of language that are emerging, especially around the notion of languaging. Technology is a change driver, and also new understandings of the role of teachers as change agents. Those were three change drivers that we felt confident were saying are hot topics being discussed in the literature today. It's not an exhaustive list. But when you think of the kind of research you do, can you relate it to sort of the intersection of this sort of focus or level and a change driver there? And then finally I said, we talked about how do you bring it home to someone who's not necessarily being promoted or reviewed on the basis of their published research, but really wants to do this because they want to improve the results that their students have or the job that they're doing. And we said that it may be useful if you're getting into research to think about it as an incremental process. And that one of the best places to start with research is simply doing a very detailed description, observation. Build on the notion of observation by beginning to formulate questions and thinking about, in a sense, questioning of alternatives. So going from descriptive to possibly comparative research. We could do this way, or we could do it that way. Well, let's try it both ways and see what happens. And from there, progressing to a more sort of what we might think of as a traditional hypothesis-driven type of research, all right? But simply going, therefore, from descriptive to comparative to hypothesis-driven is a way of, in a sense, if you're new to this, you're trying to figure out how can I get started, or what's my next step in terms of my own research agenda. And what we did also in the document was sort of taking these individual cells, if you will, and providing example questions so that you can begin to see how, okay, a observational question that's related to how an individual changes as a result of technology, then you might be asking this kind of research question. And that was where we finished off the project, was with this idea of we're not telling you what to do, we're trying to show you what can be done and how to understand what it is you're doing there. So, okay, make sure I got all my slides. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass it on to Kathy, who will present sort of the perspective of TERF. And then I think at the end, we're going to have June as a discussant and also hopefully time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dudley. It's very exciting for me to hear this update on the TESOL Research Agenda strategy as a way of the association trying to move this component of our profession forward in a cohesive way. I'm going to jog Jun's memory. I know that the first TESOL Research Agenda was started when I was president in 1998-99, and I know you couldn't have worked on that one, Jun, because do you remember when I met you? I met Jun at the beginning of my plenary, my presidential plenary, because he was receiving an award. His students had nominated him for an Outstanding Teacher Award, and he was that recipient that year from TESOL. So I know you weren't yet on the board. So you must have worked on the second and third instead of the first and third.
I was inspired by you.
Okay, so I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And as Dudley said, my job is to talk to you about what are called the TERF research priorities. And I'm going to use that word priorities very, very intentionally. Okay, so TIRF, T-I-R-F, stands for the International Research Foundation. The full name is the International Research Foundation for English Language Education. This foundation was started by TESOL in 1998. In 1995, Joy Reid, the person who was the TESOL president at the time, started a committee that consisted of several senior scholars and several former TESOL presidents, including Jody Crandall, who's here with us today. Please wave. Okay, good. Thank you, Jody. And their job was to try to figure out, it was almost like a feasibility study. They were supposed to figure out if there was a possibility for and room for a foundation to raise money and promote research in our field. As you know, there are many foundations that promote research, but not many of them are associated specifically with or driven by the goal of raising money and promoting research in language education and closely related fields. So that was TIRF's mission, and TESOL started TIRF in June 1998. The TESOL Board of Directors voted at that time to commit the funding to start the foundation, and I'm very grateful to this day to TESOL for that endeavor, for having the nerve to go through with that idea. There's a slide up here that shows you the homepage on the website, and I have this here because I want to alert you to some resources that could be helpful to you. Out in the atrium, there's a table with information on it, and one of the sheets of paper is an information sheet about TIRF. There's also a bookmark there that has the website, the URL on it, and I invite you to pick those up if you haven't already done so. So I want to share with you the mission statement. This has been updated a couple of times since the foundation was first established. And I share with you the mission statement because I think you'll see we're trying to be global and inclusive. We're trying to reach out to researchers, teachers, people who wish to do research, people who want to interpret research in a variety of contexts. So here's the text. TIRF's vision is that in the 21st century, personal and social value accrues to individuals who are proficient in English and in some additional language. I want to make sure that you understand that we are not an English-only organization. We're here to promote bilingualism, multilingualism, plurilingualism. Okay, thank you. I will resist the temptation to make any political comments beyond what I just said, okay? And so because of that focus, because of that stance that we wanted to take to language teaching and learning, we articulated 4 goals. And you can see the first 2 here: to implement a research and development program to generate new knowledge and information. And the second one, to promote the application of research to practical language problems. And I think this is a place where TIRF and TESOL have very, very, very common interests in terms of this whole notion of having research be very practical, being very applicable in its outcomes. The third and fourth goals are listed here. I'm not going to read all the text on the screen. I'm just going to highlight the parts that I think are most important. So I would invite you to skim the slides. And my understanding is that Sarah, our wonderful colleague from TESOL, is going to make the PowerPoint slideshows available later so that you can access this information. Don't feel like you have to take notes very, very quickly as we go. So a third goal is to collect and organize and disseminate information and research on the teaching and learning of language. Now notice it doesn't say English language. Our particular area of interest and expertise is in the teaching of English, but it's not limited to the teaching of English. I want to stress that. And then finally, to influence the formation and implementation of appropriate language education policies, recognizing the importance of indigenous languages and cultures worldwide and of English as an international language. So this part of the slogan for the weekend we're spending here together about an inclusive, sustainable research community really reverberates with me, and I think with my colleagues on the TIRF Board of Trustees. As you can see, this idea of inclusiveness is central to our mission and vision. So that's the sort of framing set of comments that I want to give you. Now, my assignment was to tell you about TERF's research priorities. And you can find these and get more information if you go to the homepage and click on the major button that says TERF Sponsored Research. I'm going to just give you a few highlight comments, but if you go to that button, you'll find much more information about the priorities. Full descriptions are given, and also there are examples of research topics, research questions that you might consider. Okay. I want to give you just a little bit of background so that you'll understand why the topics I'm going to share with you have been selected and deemed important. First of all, TERF is not a membership association, it's a foundation. We have a board of trustees, and that board of trustees is the group that determines what the research priorities are. And I'm using the term priorities in the sense that Dudley was talking about earlier, the notion of the kind of shopping list. In a way, the priorities I'm going to show you do constitute TERF's shopping list in the sense that these are the things we want to support financially. But as is often the case, if you go to the grocery store, you have your shopping list in mind, but you also know you have a budget. So in any given week, you may not be able to get the steak and the lobster and the caviar, right? So you have to decide, is this a chicken week or a tuna week or a caviar week, that sort of thing. So you establish priorities that are in part governed by your desires and interests, but in part governed by your budget. Sometimes it's a question of where can I best spend my money? And that theme will come up quite often as we talk about research. So sometimes our research priorities are funded and determined by external sources of revenue. And as an example, a few years ago, we got a wonderful grant, an ongoing 3-year grant, from a man named Sheikh Nahyan, who was the Minister of Education. Oh, he had a title that was about 50 words long, and education and research were part of it. And he wanted to see research done on the teaching and learning of English in the Arabic-speaking world. That was his first goal, to promote actual studies on the teaching and learning of English in the Arabic-speaking world. And his second goal, which I think aligns very nicely with what we're doing here this weekend together, was that he wanted to build a research community of scholars in the region who could talk to one another, train teachers, promote research, inform policy, and so on. So I give the cover of the book that came out of from the studies that he funded as an example of point 2 up here, that sometimes TERF takes on a research priority that is determined by an external source. But for the most part, the research priorities are determined by the trustees. What do we do with them? Well, these research priorities drive projects. And the project that I want to focus on today is what we call our doctoral dissertation grant program. Let me see a show of hands. Who in the audience is a doctoral candidate? Great. Who in the audience might be a doctoral candidate? At some point. Okay, good. Who in the audience survived the experience of being a doctoral candidate? Okay, so there's life after the PhD, those of you that are in it or thinking about it, all right? So what we do every year is have a competition. We look at proposals that have to meet a certain format and meet certain criteria, and we award funding to as many grants as we can support. We've had wonderful, wonderful support from a number of individuals and also organizations, and I might mention a few of these as we go along, but I don't want to get too embroiled in that. The research priorities are updated regularly. They change, some come, some go, some morph a bit. We add new priorities as essential issues arise. So one night it might be caviar, another night it might be tuna. I'm going to give you a thinking assignment, because here it is, it's a summer day, you're in a closed room, there's no windows, people are talking to you. These are comfortable seats. I know I've sat in those seats many times. So I'm going to give you a thinking assignment to engage your brain so you don't accidentally kind of doze off as I'm talking. And here it is. I want you to do one of two things. As I go through these priorities, please think about how they relate to you and your interests or your colleagues' interests, okay? I want you at the end of this session to be prepared either to pose a question, to think of some question that relates to these priorities and your own work, or to share a comment about your work as to how these research priorities or anything that Dudley said about the research agenda from TESOL might be useful to you or your colleagues. So please try to make some connections. I'm going to share with you now just a little bit of information about each of the currently 7 research priorities that TERF has. For each one, I'm going to show you a list of sample topics or research questions that might be posed. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a wonderful panel where we have 3 interesting researchers looking at 3 very different projects and talking about how they came to frame their research questions, what methods they chose to address those questions, and so on. So you might be getting some ideas from the topics or the sample research questions that I share with you. I also am going to share a couple of examples of studies related to each of the research priorities. And I want to point out to you that these are very international in nature. The site of the study is not always the United States. The researcher is not always from the United States. And sometimes there are fascinating combinations of researchers from one country doing their doctorate in another country and studying, teaching, and learning in another country. I'll show you some really cool examples. Now, why do we focus on doctoral research? Once again, you have limited resources. You have to decide where to put your money. It was determined by the original early members of the early boards of trustees that an interesting sticking point, and now those of you who are doctoral students or thinking about being doctoral students, don't let this piece scare you, okay? An interesting sticking point is that some people start their doctoral studies and run out of money, or get bogged down, or run out of time and have to go back to work, or kind of hit a brick wall in terms of resources. And so our early boards of trustees wanted to do something to help people finish. They wanted to provide resources and support so that people could finish the doctorate. So doctoral dissertation grants from TERF are open to people who've completed their studies, they've got a research plan approved, they've finished their coursework, if any, and their supervisor and a committee have approved a proposal for research. In US terms, I'm not sure if this phrase is used everywhere, but it's referred to as being advanced to candidacy. You're ready to go. You're ready to do your research and write your dissertation. And for many people, you've heard the expression ABD, all but dissertation. That can be a stopping point, and we want to lower the hump. We want to make that speed bump just a speed bump, not a brick wall. So that's why today the program I'm sharing with you is the Doctoral Dissertation Grants Program. Okay, quickly through the research priorities, and I'm not going to read the text. The first one that we ever settled on when we first started giving away funding was on students' age and effective English language education. Now, in recent years, we've had some really interesting studies that have been done on this, but this topic is no longer the hot topic that it was some years ago in second language acquisition. I don't know if we're going to phase it out or not, but it's not getting in as many applications as some of our other research priorities. You can see some samples of topics here in this bulleted list. And I want to show you examples of studies from 2 different people. This is a photo of and the title of a study by a young man named Mohammed Asif Qureshi, who is from the United Arab Emirates, and he looked at a kind of a grammatical, a syntax acquisition kind of study. And another one is from this young woman, Wuqi Yang, from China. She did her doctorate at University of Iowa, and she was looking at the identities of culturally and linguistically diverse students in an after-school book club. Jody and I are just working on a book now that's a collection of TERF-funded studies, and it's lovely to read her paper, and the way she worked with these young girls is like 11-year-old girls in an after-school book club. Okay, so the next one, and this is a topic that's getting a lot of attention now. Some of you may know about this from your own work or from your own background, and that is English as a medium of instruction. Countries all around the world are shifting from the home language, the native language, even the official language of the country, to English as the medium of instruction, frequently at university levels, often at lower levels. Now, as English teachers, those of us who are English teachers might think, great. But on the other hand, what is the effect on the learners? What is the effect on the teachers if they're not prepared to teach their subject matter in English? So this one's a really hot topic now. You can see here a few bulleted questions that are sample questions related to this issue. Because this is such a hot topic, we found some additional questions that are arising on a regular basis. Now, I want to tell you that if you were to propose a study, you don't have to answer one of our research questions. Find a research question or a research topic of your own that's related to TERF priorities and apply. These are not a limited list. These are suggestions. Okay. I guess I like this topic. I had a lot of slides on this one. It's because it's so fascinating and it's happening in so many countries. I was just at a conference in Italy 2 weeks ago and heard a fascinating talk about a policy decision to switch 5 colleges in Finland switched to English as a medium of instruction as a way of promoting English language development as well as subject matter learning among their students. Okay, so here's an example. This young woman is from France. I'm not going to try to pronounce her name. And she's looking at English as medium of instruction in French higher education. So this is happening quite a bit in Europe. We don't have her study yet. By the way, when a student proposes and gets accepted, what you can find on the TERF website is the synopsis of their proposal, like an abstract of their proposal, how to contact them if you want more information, and an initial reference list. When they finish, they send us a very brief, like a 2-page summary of their study, and a final reference list. So you can find out about the results of these studies on our website, and you can also contact them. If you see a study that interests you, I encourage you to contact the researcher. Now, let me just tell you that I'm only showing you a few studies today. Since we started funding studies, we've supported 98 doctoral students from 22 different countries. But to apply, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen. You don't have to be a TESOL member, though I'm sure Chris would appreciate it. You just have to be advanced to candidacy in a legitimate doctoral program. Okay, whoops, that's the wrong button, Kathy. Another really, really hot topic, and one for which we get a lot of applications, is language assessment. As you know, language tests influence the lives of learners and teachers all around the world every day. And we're trying to promote research on language assessment so we can better understand how to generate valid and reliable and appropriate assessment procedures and tools, and how the results of language assessment can best be used to inform teaching, program administration, and so on. So here's some sample topics. This is Nick Jiwebi. He did, as you can see from the title, which I'm not going to read, he did a really technical, statistically oriented study. That's fine. We have room for heavily quantitative statistical analyses. We also welcome qualitative studies and mixed methods research. What matters to your proposal reviewers if you apply to TERF, and by the way, if you apply for any grant proposal, what matters to the reviewers is whether you have chosen the correct research methods to address your research questions. Quantitative, qualitative, mixed doesn't matter to us as long as there's a really good fit with your topic and your research questions. So, in addition to Nick, this is a completely different kind of study. Tasha Darbs from the United States was talking about placing immigrant students in community colleges. This is an extremely practical issue, one that's very important throughout the U.S. Sudeh Ekstad from Iran was talking about the cultural implications of assessment procedures in English, French, and Persian as foreign or second language classes. And I am very pleased to be able to show you this slide because I think her focus on English, French, and Persian is an example of the fact that we're not operating in a world where English is unaffected by other languages, or where our learners are unaffected by other languages. We need to be aware of that all the time. Okay, another topic is language planning and policy. Here's a list of some example items, and I'm very happy that tomorrow afternoon we're going to have a wonderful panel that Jody Crandall is chairing. Terry Wiley is here, and George Bunch, and Jean Garcia. Is Jean here yet? Okay, and it's going to be about the issue of language planning and policy and how it relates to research, how researchers can influence language planning and policy, and so on. Okay, so a couple more bullet points on that topic. Again, I must refrain from making any wild political statement. Let me just say that I think in the next 3 years and 8 months, research and policy are going to be extraordinarily important to us in our profession in this country. A few more bullets. Oh, a few more bullets. This is the topic that Jody and I are working on in this book we're editing, so this is really on my mind right now. Okay, so here's a picture of this fascinating guy. I haven't met him yet, but I've been reading his work. Aziz Khan is from Pakistan, and he's got a paper in the book we're working on. He looked at 2 Pakistani teachers in secondary school contexts and how they used Urdu or Pashtun or English in their teaching. It's really interesting stuff. We're so happy to have a scholar from Pakistan participating. This one is another really interesting case. Virak Chan, he was our first ever applicant from Cambodia and was selected to have his study supported as well. So he's looking at the medium of instruction policies in higher education in Cambodia. This is another really interesting person. This young woman is Eloise. I don't always say Eloise or Eloise. Whatever, my French is so rusty, I won't even try it. She's from the Philippines, but she's studying in France, and she's interested in early childhood education. So, like Dudley was saying, one of the interesting things of TESOL is that it encompasses so much. And one of the ways that TESOL, and indeed language education in general, encompasses so much is we're talking about very young children to very senior adults as learners in our classrooms and in our communities. Okay. This is a really important one, and Leslie, I've got something for you in here. I picked this one just because of you. So language teacher education, I mentioned to you earlier that sometimes we revise the priorities. One of our early priorities was the role of the non-native speaking teacher. And as we were getting proposals on that topic, quite a few of those proposals had to do with teacher education, research on teacher education. So we broadened that topic, and now we're getting lots and lots of proposals on this issue. Here are a few bullet points. And a few more. And a few more. I got carried away. So I think that this title and this young man is so interesting. This is Ayman al-Sheikh from Sudan, and he did a case study of Sudanese EFL teachers' knowledge and identity construction when he was a doctoral student at Indiana. We're still in touch with Ayman. He's doing a lot with teacher education in Africa. Another good one is from Patsy Vinogradov. Some of you might have met Patsy because she was here in Monterey a little while ago. Wrong one? Okay. Okay.
Somehow you're on the corner over there. I don't know.
What do I do about that?
There.
Thank you. I was telling Chris and Jun when they met Renee at the beginning of this session, if you really want to ever get anything done in academia, it's great to have a dean who's in your own field. I mean, I really don't think a chemist or an economist would have stood up and done that for me, right? Okay, I'm going to move this along because I'm using up too much time. So Patsy did this fascinating study where she was looking at adult education teachers who often, as you know, have to work with emerging literacy. So many times immigrants and refugees in our adult education classes need literacy help. And she had those teachers work with kindergarten teachers. And they learned so much. It was lovely. Ali Fuad Selvi is from Turkey. He did a great study. Again, this is teacher education. Let me move along fast because Ryan's waving the time signal at me, and I really always have to do what Ryan says or I get in a lot of trouble. Okay, plurilingualism, this is a topic we really want more studies on. The ability to use more than one language in the context of business, industry, and the profession. We're not getting enough applications on this topic, and we wish we were. You can see the bullet points. A few more. A few more. As I said before, you'll have the slides, so forgive me for rushing. This is a really fascinating study. Angelica Galante is from Brazil, and she's working on, now she's working on teacher training and doing a great job with it. We're so happy to have her as part of our team. Let me just show you the countries rather than worrying about the individuals too much, okay? So our first applicant from Nepal is doing a really good study. Bal Sharma is working about the whole notion of tourism in Nepal as part of their emerging economy. Fascinating guy. And then Joyce Kling, whom some of you recognize as her activities in TESOL. She was a TESOL board member some years ago, living in Copenhagen and working on teacher identity and English medium of instruction. A wonderful guy, Jaehan Park from Korea, whom Jody knows. She worked with him quite a bit. All right, so wrapping these up, the last topic I want to share with you is digital technology. There's so much going on in technology today. It's changing so fast. It's influencing our profession. It's definitely influencing our students in terms of what they can accomplish, the materials they can access, the opportunities for authentic input that they have. Here are some more bullets. Okay, so this young man, I just think this is fascinating. He is from Norway? And I missed his name, didn't I? Okay, this one is, he's with Passy Duff, right, at British Columbia? Yeah, so he's from Norway. He's doing his doctorate in Canada, and his project is on technology and storybook building, storytelling in Africa, okay? It's such an interesting mix. Another example of that, Frits de Groot is from the Netherlands, and this is one, Leslie, that I really want you to take a look at because it's teacher training in Thailand context. It's a fascinating story, and if you'll check with me later, I'll give you the citation. Okay, so things that might be of help to you, immediate practical help. If you go to the website and click on the button called Access to Resources, you can find a whole bunch of resources that may be good for you, all right? How could, I ask you to be thinking about, if you're not a doctoral student, how could this be relevant to you? Well, in a couple of ways. Number one, if you're trying to propose a master's thesis or get funding for a study that's related to one of our priorities, you can say, well, hey, TERF thinks this is an important priority, so therefore I feel supported, all right? Also, I want to encourage you to look at the findings of the kinds of studies that I've just been sharing with you. Remember, there are 98 that have been funded so far. And also, if you click there, you'll find a list of reference lists on over 200 topics of current interest. For those of you who are panelists, I gave you a printout in your envelope of the existing 200 lists because I'm thinking that in your panels and in your breakout sessions, people are going to ask you, well, how can I learn about whatever, affective factors in language learning? So if you would go to this page on our website, these reference lists are stored as free downloadable Word documents. They're updated regularly. Help yourself. If you see a topic that's not addressed, write to me. If you see a topic that needs updating and you have some published studies we could add, write to me. Okay, so those, if you click on that button, you'll come to this page of resources. The first thing up there is the reference lists. But for the purpose of this weekend and this group, I want to point out to you that there's an annotated bibliography that was first started when I was president of TESOL, and it's about language classroom research, teacher research, research methodologies. If you're trying to figure out what's a good source I could go to learn about doing action research, to learn about doing observation, that's a place to start. So I just want to close by saying I love our theme. I think this theme of building an inclusive, sustainable research community in TESOL is very, very exciting. And I would like to encourage you as you meet people this afternoon and tomorrow to be sure and share your name, share your business card. Let's start building this community right here and right now. So, oops, I did it again. Thank you, Ryan. That's probably a future dean right there. So to wrap up, I want to thank Sarah. Where are you now, Sarah? She's probably running. Okay, there she is. So Sarah's been working tirelessly on this project for well over a year, as was Rosa, our former executive director, and now we have Chris with us, so thank you, TESOL. And there was a really good steering committee that helped with this. There have been over 20 members of the MIIS staff, not counting faculty, working on this event. And then Ryan always makes everything happen. And I want to also acknowledge Amanda. Can you wave, please? So if this young woman is wandering around and sticking a camera in your face, she's official. Okay, Amanda Weiland's been the intern. So that's all I have to share with you today. Jen, I'm sorry I've talked so long, but I know that you will be able to wrap this up in stellar fashion. Oh, God. How long did that last? Way long. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much. I was asked to sit next to them, but I chose to sit here because I feel I can say something without being worried about anything. Because as a discussant, I need to stand neutral and also draw some highlights of what you heard from these two stellar researchers representing two most important associations. One is TESOL, one is TIRF. So as someone who worked for TESOL for years and now working with TIRF, I feel this joint session is monumental. It sets a tone that in the future, we really need to work together if we want to get research bought in by our members. So I think this is significant, and I want to once again acknowledge, Chris, this is your first symposium as a new executive director of TESOL. The very fact that you chose to come here indicates that you will support research wholeheartedly in the future. So we want to thank you. Are you taping? No. But it can be on record. It can be on record. Dudley, one more thing I want to say. You know Kathy. Kathy is very unique. She has been and is. She is a person who has served for 3 associations as presidents. President of TESOL, who inspired me to be president of TESOL 10 years later. President of AAAL, which is known as a research entity, mainly for higher education researchers, and the president of TIRF. So you have the credibility to show us what you have done of TIRF. And actually TIRF evolved from TESOL. Yeah. Half of TIRF directors, trustees, are past TESOL presidents. And others are also very active in different fields. So I feel like the first point I want to make is that TESOL and TIRF will always work together and should work together to empower ourselves. So that is very, very important. Secondly, as someone who has participated in both developing TESOL agenda and TIRF priority, I feel they are different, but they are related. The difference is that TESOL agenda is very comprehensive. It's an overall map and framework for all members who come from different constituents. TIRF has a very focused area, and we want to empower our young leaders, like doctoral students, young teachers, to be interested, to be engaged in doing research in order to better serve TESOL. If we have TIRF, do we need research in TESOL? Yes, we do. So that's why I want to challenge a few things by raising 10 questions out of our 2 presentations. I jot down notes, and I feel I need to make 10. The first issue we need to think about is that regardless of TESOL agenda or TESOL priorities, how do they come out? How did TESOL agenda priorities evolve? You put together a group of people. They are considered the researchers, and they work remotely, contributing to the agenda, running through several drafts, and that's done. But also they are based upon research, survey research by TESOL, for instance. But do they stay constantly, or they need to evolve and change constantly given the different situations? Agenda is good, but the agenda will always change. Priorities will be in this year, but might not be in next year. And we cannot have too many priorities. If we have priorities, we might have the top priorities, or the priority, such as US education in the current climate, turbulent times for students in learning English. The second question is, what role does it play for different TESOL members? Some priorities might be relevant to certain members. As we remember, in TESOL, we have majority of them are from K through 12, schools, many from higher education. But also, increasingly, we have international population, international membership. Is the US priority a global priority? So these are the things, issues we need to think twice in order to really make our research inclusive as a global association. Third, given the rapid change of English language learners, we are now facing digital generation and advancement of technology. How often should we update, change, or modify what we think appropriate? So that there evolves constant change and takes time for us to really put them into practice. Number 4, which is something I feel important, is that how can our convention, annual conventions, symposia, and TESOL academies, and TESOL Quarterly, TESOL Journal, incorporate TESOL agenda and the research priorities? Are they consistent? Who determines the research, the symposium or convention themes? And are they checking with the research priorities to determine plenary speakers? So these are some of the things we have not put it together yet. If we can do a better job, let's say if this is TESOL priority, TERF priority, TESOL priority, TESOL agenda, let's make sure that one of the speakers will talk about that, will show us the research on that particular topic. That you can intertwine, harmonize our agenda, our priority with our publicity, with our convention, with our dissemination through our publications. So this is something I want to challenge both organizations to think how we can really work together. Number 5, how can we engage 70% of TESOL members, or the majority of people, in carrying out the research as a part of their own professional identities? Because when you talk about research, teachers don't think irrelevant. Why? Because they are not going to get tenured because of research. It's not a priority for them. And as someone who went through tenure track, I had to publish. I had to do research. I was looking for research, but evaluation criteria are different for teachers. They will see how many students pass certain grades and how many of them actually go to colleges. So those are the different priorities, and we need to consider their own situation in order to really make research more encouraging, more exciting, or something become part of their own professional identity. Number 6, I don't know what I wrote, but okay. For those publication research is not needed as a priority, how can we help them? So this is very similar. But the point is that in order to make it inclusive, we need to redefine research and really think broadly, what is the context of research in different people's working environment? Number 7 is how can we, okay, skip over, okay. I cannot even read my own handwriting. How can we generate and allocate more resources to support TERF's research priorities? As you notice, all those doctoral dissertations, all those priorities, we need resources to support, right? And the TERF Board of Trustees working so hard, try to allocate the resources. But the TESOL, for instance, can join hands by providing some resources to support TERF's research priorities as a return to empower TESOL members. We need to think in that way. TERF cannot work by itself. TERF needs TESOL support, and TESOL needs TERF support. So I think this is the time for us to engage in discussion how we can work together. My power is out. Oh, okay. All right. And last two. How can, I don't know which number, okay. How can we rethink of our profession within the overall change of K-12 and higher education? For instance, hello? Yes, okay. Now, children start learning English at the age of 5 or 6. But our curriculum in ESL are still the same, or more or less the same. Start teaching grammar rules. So as I witnessed over the years, there are many students who do not have high scores, cannot or are not engaged in college ESL classes. Why is it? Because teachers are repeating the same thing, because they do not do well. But you cannot do it in the same way. Content medium instruction, for instance, is a new way. And we need to think about how can we engage our learners? They repeat the same thing, get bored, don't progress, and pay extra tuition for intensive English program. And when they move on, they have to take ESL composition. When they finish, they have to take freshman composition. When they finish freshman composition, they are struggling while writing their thesis in English. So this is the cycle we are facing. So we really need to look at how we not teach English, how we can empower them in using language to help themselves in different ways. And this also needs research and to really look at the global context. And finally, last but not least, how can we use our research to compete, influence, inform, or challenge our educational companies, agencies out there? Lots of pathway programs into Navita or others, they are taking the territory of our ESL, English language education, but they are not professionals. And many universities, because of the revenue stream, they allow them to take over. A director from St. Louis School of ESL was fired because Into took the territory. It's sad. And I would say that because we have to use our research to differentiate from those pure business models and to empower ourselves. So if our research can be relevant to empower not only our members, but also our field, to really set a tone by using all those disseminate all those research, I feel that we are going to be better recognized. We will really feel the power of research. So I will just stop here. And these are just my thoughts inspired by these two presenters. And some of them needs debate, but now it's time to open the floor for you to ask questions and for our presenters to answer or to engage in dialogue. I will pass our microphone to the floor.
So, thank you, Jun. So we have a few minutes before our break starts, and then there'll be breakout sessions where we can talk in much more smaller groups. Much more smaller. Okay. My 7th grade teacher would not be happy with me for that. So does anybody have a comment or a question to pose at this point? Teresa. Ryan, can you give Teresa the microphone?
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Tishakov, and I work in Oslo, Norway at a teacher training program. And I was educated here in Monterey with Kathy. So I come from an environment of understanding TESOL and a research agenda and such. but I'm in a reality where my daily life is very much distant from the daily doings of TESOL and TERF. And I struggle how to keep my identity as a TESOL member and a TESOL supporter and an individual who wants to be engaged in research with the needs and demands of my realities. So I'm kind of interested how TESOL and TERF can think about and how we can think about how we can actually really extend the community globally. Because my micro context is so different than what I read about and such in TESOL.
You know what I'd like to do, Teresa? This is going to sound a little like and might be a lot like avoidance.
Yeah,
I think
that's
what we
okay.
should do at this point is let the questions surface rather than having any of us try to respond. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So I see a comment back there from Marisol.
Ryan's our runner.
I'm good with stairs.
Getting your fit. Do I have to stand? Do it. First of all, I just wanted to comment to June Liu's talk. That was like a David Letterman shtick you just did. That was awesome. Like top 10.
I like David Letterman.
Yeah,
very
no,
much.
I can tell you do. Marisol Santos from San Francisco State. I've been thinking about since Kathy's slide about the age and that as a TERF priority, and you made the comment, how long will it stay around? Because it was at a timestamp where it was of high relevance. I was recently at a conference where I learned that from bench science to clinical practice, medical research takes about 17 years. Now, there's a lot of controversy around that, like why does it take 17 years to get from science in a petri dish into real clinical practice? But it's made me think about time, not jet lag, time lags. I finished grading last night. That is my only excuse. Time lags in research as a way of determining priorities. Yeah. And thinking that, yes, it's great to get doctoral students when they've come to a special place and they're thinking where they want to own this topic, but let's get them earlier where we can say, here are some research, here's some topics we have been studying for 5 decades, and yet the world is still not convinced that we know what we're talking about. And I'm going back to the age thing, because we're still debating this, because in many ways the press trumps our science. And so I'm thinking that another way, like I'd like to go back and look at the TERF priorities and even thinking about master's level research as those places where you can revisit where we really need to fight against the time lags, that what are things that we keep researching but it's not changing practice, so that we can step aside from that accusation of being just navel gazers, because that, I think, is the most hurtful critique, because we love our topics. Right. Anyway, I mean, I come from a health world, so I think about this often, but I'm just curious, empirically, what is our 17-year metric? What is it really? And the age question would probably be a good place to start looking at that. Thank you for a wonderful start.
Thank you.
There's one over here. Oh, good. Lots of questions.
Hi, I'm Kim Helmer, and I'm also a graduate of MA TESOL here, and I'm currently teach at UC Santa Cruz. And I think June Liu's presentation really roused in me the idea of ethics that I don't see completely covered in the agendas. With the influx of so many international students, especially from China, coming to the United States, when June Liu was talking about these educational companies coming in and taking the power away from educators or people who are really knowledgeable, I also see it within our own institutions who are educators. But they are taking the bottom line approach of, we've got 55,000 K coming in this year, and not supporting our students. And I don't think our associations are coming to put these universities to task. That you just can't have students come in and not support them. You can't just think of them as dollar signs. And I don't know what our organizations are doing with that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I think there's a comment on this side, Ryan, before you go to Leslie, okay?
probably don't need this. That's okay. I'm Amy. I'm from St. George's University in Grenada, West Indies. Hi. I have family here too, so it's not just a big trip. I kind of want to speak to a couple different things. I also work in healthcare system. I work with the School of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine. We're a US-based curriculum. So there's a couple people here, is it Teresa? That I kind of feel a link with. And really this is related to the inclusive part, where what we really see is a lot of world Englishes and Creoles of our students. And how do we help these students in a professional environment who are really getting lost and they're getting through med school to an extent and then they get stuck, they can't go on because of their English language abilities. And I think there's real value in finding out what's happening in some of these smaller situations like ours. What's happening there? How can we take that small, individualized example and really stretch that out to be important for everyone in TESOL and in TERF. So I think these really specific situations can lead to a lot of value.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Leslie?
Yeah, Leslie Barrett at Ratchapatorayat University in Thailand. And I just wanted, it's not really a question, it's more a request, because I've looked at the TERF website a lot. I've looked at the TESOL website a lot, but I didn't ever see before the annotated bibliography, and I'm thrilled to see that, and I wonder how many other hidden, lovely little things. I mean, I guess I'll have to click on everything, but if there are some that you know about, if you can share them, that, you know, because Doreen and I, neither of us had ever seen it, and so I think it's great.
Good.
It's great.
Thank you.
Is TERF website a link on TESOL main page? Yes.
I don't know if we're linked. Yes? Okay, yes. Yes. So these have been 5 or 6 really important questions. Chris, was that a turn bit or a wave?
I want to I have a quick comment on, I'm Chris Casnave, and I've been around for longer than most of you have been alive. Anyway, happy.
Chris is not kidding. She is the
Yeah.
person that hired me here.
Wow.
And I've been working here for 35 years.
Oh, wow.
So she's not making this up.
I am not making this up. I am not making this up. I have just a comment about the time issue, the time legacy, and something that in my own work with master's and doctoral students after I left Monterey and went elsewhere, although I never did really leave Monterey, I still live in Oak Grove, 3 blocks from Gabrielle. Anyway, turns out, just learned that today. There's this weird thing that we think once research has been done, that it doesn't need to be done again. And what's curious is that research that's done does not become genetically part of our bodies, and so needs to be relearned with every single generation starting from scratch. And this is a problem that I deal with my own students. You know, they come up with a wonderful idea for a research project. And I'm thinking to myself, but that's been done before, and that was done 37 years ago by so-and-so, and you can look it up on such and such a journal. And there's a need, I think, for people in every generation of researchers, whether they're foreign language, second language, English language researchers, whatever, to understand the homework that needs to be done in order to know what needs to be done. And I think some of my own students, maybe just because they haven't had time, haven't done enough homework. You know, I mean, it's very depressing for them and for me to say, that's been done already. And if you want to do it again or do it slightly differently, you have to have done your homework to know what has already been done. Because it does not become genetically part of your body and part of our field unless you constantly, with each generation, rebuild your own history. So I don't know where that's going, but anyway, that was just a comment about time and learning over generations.
Chris, I want to just add, because I agree with you, and I think but a related issue also is that when we talk about what's the agenda for research in the field, part of that agenda is the use of research, and that we need to, or we should be thinking about how do we support the use of research, as well as and part of that is making research accessible in a variety of formats so that people know what has been done. I mean, I think it's really telling when we say, oh, you mean that's a resource that's there, we didn't know it was there, we didn't, you know, and this is coming from someone who's a very skilled finder of information. And I know, because I've worked with Leslie for a long time, how skilled she is at it. So part of what will sustain our community is also not only thinking about what's the next project, but how does research fit in? How do we make it accessible? And those are things that we should be strategizing.
May I just, sorry.
Jim and then Ryan.
Okay, add a very quick comment after Chris. Actually, the point I did not read, or couldn't recognize, is exactly what you said. So I feel that it's time for us to really look at the digital database of TESOL research by typing keywords and years or authors, whatever you do, keywords search. That will help a great deal not to reinvent the wheel or add new knowledge to those things. That digital database, given TERF already created annotated bibliography, and TESOL has so many intersections. So when I was TESOL president, I always wished to do one thing. Each intersection needs to work on updated research, digitalize them, and that will very much empower everyone in the field.